As we discussed in yesterday's video, tuning is a very subjective and difficult thing to negotiate in test drive unlimited solar crown. Yesterday, of course, we did speak about tuning a vehicle for road racing. But what about tuning a vehicle for off-road racing? And it's probably going to be a little bit harder and even more subjective actually to what it would be for road racing. Every off-road race is going to give you different obstacles and different challenges. So the format's not going to be as plain and simple, but at the same time, it is actually going to be as plain and simple. You're going to have bumps, you're going to have jumps, and you're going to rely on, essentially in my opinion, the torque of the vehicle to get you out of many sticky situations. So what we're going to do first of all here is kind of the same format we did yesterday. We'll head on over first of all into the workshop and take a look at adding parts to the car. Now, every single off-road vehicle I've got, unfortunately, I've already tuned. I've already fitted all the parts to, and I've already got these things balanced the way it was. But I'm going to kind of walk through the same scenario as we did for road racing. Again, subjective to the RP. If you are looking to save RP or offer off-road racing, I would obviously come in and throw on the off-road suspension, instantly saving that RP. Then I would look about how is the race going to balance. If I'm trying to get this thing through the course as quickly as possible, but also as stable as I can, well, instantly we're fitting the off-road tyres. Again, we can see we're saving a huge amount of RP from 641, we're dropping all the way to 616. So already between the off-road tyres and the off-road suspension, you're saving a lot of RP, where you can then put that towards the vehicle itself. Having the off-road suspension that's higher off the ground is going to be better for off-road racing, and obviously with off-road tyres it's better for off-road racing. Then we want to try and get some power applied to it. Again, fitting the parts that make most sense, where you're getting the most performance, not to 60 specifically or not to 30 times, aren't going to matter all too much for off-road racing. You want to be using the higher end, the torque of the vehicle, specifically with an absolute monster 800 horsepower Q7 here. Again, it's not going to be that high if you're restricted to RP, so tuning this thing tactically, maybe you want to stick on the performance, the responsive or the powerful turbo. In this instance, the powerful turbo, you're actually using more RP, unlike the responsive. Unlike yesterday's video in the Mustang, we actually saved RP using the powerful turbo. The responsive turbo is probably going to be more than enough for most RP restricted races. Again, you would then have a look through the rest of the car for engine parts, where you're going to get the most gains for RP. Usually it's going to be the exhaust system. Sometimes the pistons here, or is it the spark plugs, have a little bit of a glitch where between performance and super sport or performance and sports, it actually drops RP by getting a better part. So having a look through the list there, fitting the decent amount of engine parts on a restricted race, well, are you really thinking about braking? Well, typically you could make that up with the brake pressure and the brake balance, so maybe even just putting on performance brakes, you're probably going to be alright. Gearbox is a big thing for off-road racing. Now again, I would actually look towards that short gearbox if your RP allows it. As we can see, it is a considerable jump up here from 565 towards 616, so you are using a lot of RP, but if you can afford it, I like the short gearbox in game. Other than a long race, I like to work through that gearbox nice and quickly and get the gears changing on the power band. You're going to need a short gearbox for that style. Otherwise, usually your stock gearbox may be alright, and you would then want to look to upgrade the transmission itself. You're getting a lot of horsepower here, and you're also saving a fair bit of weight, and that may be where your time is then made up. Now, unlike road racing, stiffening up the chassis may actually be more beneficial. From the stock, you're at 598 all the way up to race 616. You're not using that much RP, but you can see you are saving a hell of a lot of weight, around about 130, exactly 130 kilos. So maybe that's where you would actually decide to put the RP. Save some weight. We can see the 0 to 60 time, the 0 to 30 time does increase, and also your braking distances also increase, having it stiffer and lighter. Now again, on a restrictive RP race, aero parts, they're not really going to be that OP. If you don't have a lot of RP, you're not realistically going to have that much upgrades, you're not going to have that much power. I personally don't tend to waste time on aero unless I've got a lot of RP to be working with. Tires, we've already went over that, and again, this is up for debate. I do see a lot of people using the ECU tuning. Now you're going to obviously get a lot of horsepower gains here. We can see jumping from 741 brake horsepower to 801, a considerable jump of 60 horsepower. And what we're using in terms of RP, from 591 to 516, so you aren't actually using all too much RP. It might be worth exploring this option if having some engine upgrades doesn't allow it. Again, it's going to be subjective to the car, and it's going to be subjective to the RP. If you're on a mid RP build, again, you would just work your way through here. I would be looking at upgrading that gearbox and transmission, stiffening the chassis, obviously off-road tyres, off-road suspension, maybe getting more power into here, then upgrading the braking. Is pretty much how I would go through building these vehicles. Let's now head on over to a different part of the map and talk about the tune. Where we are going to head on over to Reservoir Meeting Point. Again, pretty much in the middle of the map here, guys. I do like to come over to here, right in the heart of where most of the off-road tracks are. And essentially just come in here, feel the car in its stock format. Let's actually make sure we've got it in stock format first of all. I've got it in my off-road tune. We'll just put it in the stock format first of all here. Off-road tyres fitted, and we'll see what this thing actually feels like. Acceleration, pretty good. Brakes, I do feel are quite dire. We did touch the brakes a little bit there and they weren't spectacular. But when we do push out some of these corners, yep, we've got a lot of power here. It is a max PR build we've kind of done here. But as we throw it left and right, it does feel a little bit lazy. We can see there into the braking zone. Well, the brakes are actually pretty useless. So yeah, I would say this does need a lot of work. Then we look at the gearbox. It feels a bit lazy running up through the box. As I mentioned earlier, I like to run through the gearboxes pretty quickly. And into some of these corners, it just simply doesn't turn the way I would like it to turn. Getting the power back down on some of these drifts, it just feels a little bit lazy, and I'm not using the gearbox to my advantage here. So if we quickly come to a stop, head on into the gearbox setup, and I'm going to select that off-road tune first of all, show the difference the way this thing actually feels out of the box. We'll go from a standing start, already ripping right through the gearbox. First, second, we're already into third gear. We can start to use the gearbox, use the power around about 4,000 RPMs. Of course, this is a diesel V12. We can use the power to drag us, use the torque rather, to drag us out some of these corners, come into them, use our handbrake, let the back end flow around, make sure we're in that power band, 4,000, 5,000 RPM, just below it there, but we can see we actually got around that big sweeping left-hander in good fashion, over a jump. How do we land? We land perfectly in my opinion. Brakes set up absolutely fantastic as far as I'm concerned, exactly the way I kind of want the brakes set up here, into a left-hand hairpin, a little bit of handbrake there. We don't make the best of attempts unfortunately, but I've spent a lot of time around this very specific bit of the island here, tuning the off-road vehicles. Every single one I have is set up, apart from the latest purchase, which was the F-150, where we bought for one race on Ibiza map. We maybe have a look at tuning that in a later video if that's something you guys do want to see. But what we can now do is jump on over, have a look at the tune, and I'll kind of explain the thought process I've got for that one. So again, when you do come into all of your custom tunes, guys, make sure you do select each and every one of these buttons at the bottom of the screen. If you fail to do so, your tune won't apply. You'll have just wasted so much time. Make sure you do select all of your custom tabs at the bottom here. Now, as for the gearbox itself, I don't actually think I've done all too much work with this, apart from dropping down the final gear ratio. For some reason here, I think this is reset because I did balance this gearbox out a little bit, but nonetheless, it's an off-road race and I want this thing to grab as much as it is. I want it to have as much torque as it can, and for that I typically tend to abuse the top end, as you're going to get more torque there, and then once again have a linear motion through the gearbox, then start to balance it out. With it being off-road racing, I don't want it too aggressively towards downforce. Yes, rally cars, they will have incredible amount of downforce, but in this game I tend to find being too overpowered for downforce on an off-road race actually works against you. So I typically have a base setup around about negative 0.5 for the downforce balance. Over towards stability is going to be a no-brainer. Flip it the other way around from where we have road racing. We want this thing nice and high off the ground, so maximizing the suspension clearance. Again, if it's too much we would obviously drop it down, but the stock format, maximize it and see how it feels coming over those jumps. Then it comes down to springs, and typically everybody would come in here and make those springs as soft as they can. Well, that would actually come to a detrimental effect. It would make the car too bouncy, so when it lands it would actually hop and skip and bump over the road, and that's not something I want. I want this thing to land and settle into the ground like a rally car would. So I typically have a base setup of 105. Then we come down to compression and rebound, and we can see on the Q7 build here, they're at 100%, and I actually feel it's a very good balance. What I would, however, do is come back to that very specific part of Hong Kong Island, go over those jumps and see how it lands. For the Q7, I felt it landed pretty good, and I didn't have to make many changes. Of course, you could head on over to Ibiza, to where like the motocross style track is. There's a lot more bumps and jumps and humps there, and you might want to soften that rebound so it lands into the ground a little bit better, and maybe up the compression so it soaks everything up on a plumb. Balancing the suspension, guys, it will benefit you for these off-road racing. Then come down to the handling here. This tune has reset because I did change how this one worked. We have, of course, got a four-wheel drive off-road vehicle. Front acceleration, I would typically have this around about the 85%. I like how this thing stops, and I typically have this around about 0%, maybe up towards 5 or 10%. I do like the way the Q7 does stop. And again, braking, I typically have this around about 80 to 90% front braking. Power distribution here. Now, rally cars, you kind of want a 50-50 balance on this game. It doesn't work all too well for me. Typically, I look between 60 and 65% for the front rear split for power distribution. Central acceleration, typically I would have this around about the 100% level. Deceleration, again, around about 5 to 10%. Central brake, I think I usually have this in and around about that 90%. Go away and see how it does feel. Rear acceleration, that seems to have saved apart for deceleration. I do want that one turned all the way down to, again, 5 to 10%. Rear brake, again, all the way up to 100%. It's kind of my base format. In towards anti-roll bars here, well, we don't want anti-roll bars to be too stiff, but we also don't want to kill them. We do still want a bit of stability with the vehicle. So typically with an off-road vehicle, I would set these around about 20 and 10 front to rear. Again, go out onto the road, or the off-road for this instance, and see how those ones feel. If it's too stiff, going from corner to corner, but also trying to skip across the track, well, the anti-roll bars are too stiff, so I would loosen these ones up so it didn't feel like it was skipping and hopping across the off-road surface. Typical with camber, we want those wheels kicking in at the top, camber on negative, to get around the turns quicker, to balance the transition from left to right quicker. We do want negative camber. That's how I personally balance a car. Tire pressures, now on the Q7, 4 bar does feel good. However, most cars I would set around about 2.5 bar for off-road racing, and again, if it felt too bouncy and the thing didn't land well at all, then I would actually up the tire pressures to make them a little bit more forgiving. Lower the tire pressures to make them more forgiving. However, if it felt very poor, you didn't get a lot of acceleration, I would up the tire pressures to around about 3 bar. I'll leave them about 3 bar for this tune itself. Then of course we would talk about the braking, what we spoke about in yesterday's video about turning that brake pressure all the way down. Well, for off-road racing, I actually think it's quite poor and it doesn't work well for me personally, and usually for an off-road race I would actually have around about 300% brake pressure. Again, go out and test it on the vehicle and see how it does feel with the 70 to 30 front to rear split. I want this thing to stop nice and quickly, but also not lock up. I want this thing to feel quite good coming in and out of corners, in and out of braking zones and under acceleration. So back out here with that slight adjustment that we did make here, we can see we are actually having a bit of a better gearbox, it does feel. But with the quick changes we have just made for the suspension, we can see it actually does flick, so it does feel like the tune I built has completely reset. I'm glad we came in and done today's video. Into the braking zones, I completely did lock up, but that's because I was too busy looking at the camera. Coming to this right hand hairpin here, yeah, nice big power slide coming around there. It does feel like that this thing is moving left to right quite well. There isn't a dramatic amount of body roll between left and right. We can see as we do flick the steering here, there's not a lot of body roll. For me, that feels like the vehicle is quite well set up. And then we come into some of these power slides. Let's touch it around this little right hander, bit of e-brake there. Fantastic power slide. And the power distribution front to rear dragging us out of that corner. Unfortunately, hitting a little banking there, we do roll it, but back onto all fours, coming out of that one, it does feel pretty good as far as I'm concerned. So again, the bass tune coming into effect. If I felt like this thing didn't land that little jump there too well, I would come in and maybe stiffen or soften the suspension depending if it was too bouncy or if it just sank into the ground. It feels like the way that suspension is set up, let's feel it here. Yeah, the suspension setup actually feels pretty damn good. But one thing we did kind of touch on when we came into this is that not every tune will work simply for every off-road vehicle. They are all going to feel different depending on how they are, what kind of off-road vehicle it is. The A110 Alpine Celine Edition, for instance, fantastic off-road, but in my opinion you cannot build that like you would build an SUV. Completely different kind of car, completely different level of power, and of course a completely different bracket of weight, much like the Baja Beetle, which is pretty useless in game, but you can't build that like an SUV. So not every build is going to be a one and done, but you can have a base tune, come over to these parts of the map, explore it, see what it does feel like. That's how I kind of approach these ones, guys. These obviously may come across as very apparent, very obvious to many people who play this game day in, day out, but this has actually been a request by quite a few people on the channel now in the comments section asking how do they tune a car, how do I tune a car, what would be the tips, the tricks for tuning a vehicle for on-road racing and of course off-road racing. If it's been useful for you guys, if it's been slightly informative, that's fantastic. Let me know in the comments section. If you additionally have any tips, any tricks, please let me know and everybody else watching today's video. I do hope you have enjoyed yourself, guys. I hope the video's been good for you. Yeah, please stay tuned for more updates on Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown.